You see someone for the first time, and within 1/10 of a second, your brain has already formed an opinion. Not a vague sense. Not a preliminary impression that you will refine over the next few minutes. A concrete judgment about whether this person is trustworthy, competent, dominant, likable, and threatening. Formed before you have heard them speak. Before you know their name. Before you have any information at all beyond what your eyes captured in a fraction of a moment. This is not something you chose to do, and understanding why it happens will change how you see every first impression you have ever made or received. The speed of social judgment is one of the most replicated findings in social psychology. Psychologist Nalini Ambady at Tufts University became famous for her research on what she called thin slices, the idea that extremely brief exposures to a person are enough for observers to form accurate and surprisingly consistent judgments. In one landmark study, she showed participants 3 2-second video clips of university professors teaching and asked them to rate those professors on a series of personality traits. The ratings from those 6 seconds of silent footage correlated strongly with the ratings those same professors received from students who had spent an entire semester in their classroom. 6 seconds of silent video versus an entire semester of interaction. The judgments were remarkably similar. But why does this happen? And why so fast? To answer that question, you have to understand what your brain is actually doing when it looks at a face. The face is not simply a surface your visual system scans passively. It is the most socially significant object your brain has ever evolved to process. Dedicated neural machinery exists for almost nothing but reading faces. The fusiform face area, a region of the visual cortex, activates specifically and strongly in response to human faces in a way that it does not activate for objects, animals, or almost anything else. Your brain treats the face as a special category of information that demands immediate and intensive processing. And the information it is extracting is ancient. Psychologist Alexander Todorov at Princeton University has spent years studying what specific facial features drive rapid social judgments. His research found that 2 dimensions dominate our immediate assessment of strangers: trustworthiness and dominance. These are not arbitrary categories. They map almost precisely onto the 2 most critical questions that group living animals need to answer about any new individual they encounter. Is this entity a threat? And if it is a threat, how much of one? Trustworthiness captures the first question. Dominance captures the second. Together, they give you the essential threat profile of a stranger in under 200 milliseconds. The structure of the face itself provides the raw material for these judgments. Todorov and his colleagues found that faces with certain structural features, wider jaws, closer set eyes, particular ratios between facial regions, are consistently perceived as dominant or untrustworthy, regardless of the perceiver's culture or background. These associations are not learned from media or social conditioning alone. They appear to be deeply embedded in the way the social brain processes facial geometry. And critically, they do not require conscious thought. The judgment forms before awareness catches up. The amygdala plays a central role in this process. This small almond-shaped structure deep in the brain is your primary threat detection system, and it responds to faces with remarkable speed. Research by neuroscientist Ralph Adolphs at the California Institute of Technology found that patients with amygdala damage lose the ability to accurately judge trustworthiness from faces, even though their visual processing remains intact. The amygdala is not just detecting emotion, it is performing a rapid threat assessment of every face that enters your visual field, and it is doing it faster than your conscious mind can follow. But here's where it gets complicated. These rapid judgments are not reliable. They feel certain and they feel immediate, but they are frequently wrong. Todorov's own research demonstrated that the facial features driving trustworthiness judgments are largely unrelated to actual trustworthy behavior. A face that looks untrustworthy in a split-second assessment is not statistically more likely to belong to an untrustworthy person. The judgment is real, the accuracy is not. And yet the judgment sticks. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, whose work on fast and slow thinking transformed our understanding of human cognition, described this as the tendency of the fast intuitive system to generate conclusions automatically and pass them to the slower deliberate system as established facts rather than as hypotheses that need testing. When your brain forms a rapid judgment about a person, it does not label that judgment as tentative. It presents it as a conclusion. And subsequent information tends to be processed in a way that confirms rather than revises that initial impression. This is what psychologists call the halo effect. First documented systematically by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the early 20th century, the halo effect describes the tendency for a positive first impression in one domain to spill over into unrelated domains. If someone looks competent, you are more likely to assume they are also kind, honest, and socially skilled, even though these traits have no necessary connection. The initial impression generates a general evaluation that colors everything that follows. Research by psychologists Janine Willis and Alexander Todorov found that judgments of competence formed from 100 millisecond exposures to faces predicted the outcomes of political elections better than chance. Candidates who were judged more competent in those split-second assessments were more likely to have won their actual elections. The voters in those elections had months of information about each candidate. They had seen the debates, read the coverage, heard the policies. And still the rapid face-based competence judgment was predictive. Not because it was accurate, but because it was sticky. The stickiness of first impressions is one of the most robust findings in social psychology. Once an impression forms, contradicting information is processed differently than confirming information. A person who made a bad first impression has to work harder to overcome it than a person who made a good first impression has to work to maintain it. The initial judgment creates an interpretive frame through which all subsequent behavior is filtered. A warm gesture from someone who made a positive first impression is taken at face value. The same gesture from someone who made a negative first impression is more likely to be interpreted as manipulative or insincere. Understanding this does not make you immune to it. The rapid judgment system is not something you can simply turn off by knowing it exists, but it does give you something valuable. The awareness that the certainty you feel about a first impression is not evidence of its accuracy. The confidence with which your brain delivers its initial verdict on a stranger is generated by the speed and automaticity of the process, not by the quality of the information. The person who seemed cold when you first met them may simply have been anxious. The person who seemed overconfident may have been performing a social role they were not entirely comfortable with. The person who struck you as untrustworthy may have features that happen to activate your threat detection circuitry in a way that has nothing to do with who they actually are. What your brain did in that first fraction of a second was ask one of the oldest questions your species has ever faced. Is this person safe? And it answered it with the tools that evolution provided. Tools calibrated for a world of small groups and simple signals, now applied to a world of strangers, cities, and social complexity. Those tools were never designed to navigate. The judgment formed in 1/10 of a second is real. The certainty feels absolute. But the person standing in front of you is not the impression your brain assembled from their face. They are everything that impression leaves out, which it turns out is almost everything.